Bob Bennett himself recently stated in a speech that I heard him give, when we as Republicans are in the minority, the only real power we have is to vote no. Well, I can vote no just as well as he can, but I'll do it a lot more often than he does.
Nice.
First, like a statement. I don't think that you need to be addressed as a rookie going in. Your principles are rooted in the Constitution. The man that's in there, his principles are not. And the power that he's using is being misused. He doesn't even qualify for rookie status.
I like you. Nice. Nice. Good take,
I've
Jeff.
got three points, 3 questions, and I keep bringing this up to you. I'm watching for evolution. I have seen it.
Am I a monkey at this point, or what?
No, you're walking straight up.
Okay, good.
I like that. Would you consider favoring legislation that would require the Supreme Court Justice of the United States to base all decisions on original intent, specifically excluding case law, and write briefs that would explain where they got it, and if they don't, they will be impeached and prosecuted for perjury against the oath that they've taken?
Yeah, I think I'd go for something like that. Let me clarify one point though. I think I agree with the rest of your statement. I wouldn't necessarily say excluding all case law, because some case law is right, some case law is wrong. There is a lot of contempt for case law these days, and understandably so. Case law does have its place. The problem, well, there are a couple problems with case law. The first problem is we've come to regard case law as replacing the text of the Constitution, which it doesn't. Case law can be useful, but only insofar as it guides us to a proper interpretation of the text of the Constitution as it was originally understood. Excuse me. Secondly, we've come to regard case law as something that ought to be binding, ought to be the beginning and the end of the analysis in all 3 branches of government. Case law is sometimes useful for deciding cases and controversies in court, which is what courts do. They decide individual cases. But that doesn't mean that for all intents and purposes, that's what the Constitution actually means. So the Commerce Clause cases I referred to earlier, the fact that they will allow Congress to get away with certain things, with regulating any activity that in the aggregate substantially affects interstate commerce, that doesn't mean that that's what the Commerce Clause actually means. It just means that that's what the courts are willing to regulate or not. So I think I would agree with your statement with that kind of proposal, so long as it focused a little bit more on the text rather than excluding all case law. Because again, some case law is right. Some case law is good. Let me give you a good example. About 25 years ago, the Supreme Court decided a case called Corporation of the Presiding Bishop of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints versus Amos. I know a fair amount about that case because my dad argued it. It was a good case. The LDS Church was sued because there was a guy working at Deseret Gym who lost his job because he wasn't an active Mormon. And the church defended itself by saying, no, we have this exemption, the statutory exemption to Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that allows us to prefer our own active members in employment decisions if they're working in a job that is part of the church's religious mission, which the Deseret Gym at that time was. The Supreme Court of the United States looked through that line of, they looked through the text of the Constitution, through the original understanding of it, through all of its applications, and concluded it is okay, it doesn't violate the Establishment Clause of the U.S. Constitution for Congress to grant a religious exemption to a religious employer. Now, that precedent was correct. That precedent was decided in a manner consistent with the text of the Constitution. That precedent ought to be something that can be referred to. But it ought to be referred to not as a substitute to the text. It ought to be looked to insofar as it helps the court understand the text. Anyway, probably a longer-winded answer than you were after. I otherwise agree with your statement.
Well, you've come a long way. Thank you.
Thank you.
Second question has to do with the Fed, and this got kind of 2 parts to it. First question, yes or no? Will you support the dissolvement of the Fed?
Yes.
Nice.
Number two, that's going to take some time. In the interim, would you support legislation that will control the Fed in various ways? And one of the big things that I see right now is that they're not using TARP or stimulus money to take the toxic debt off the hands of the banks. And by the way, the only banks that it takes the toxic debt from these commercial and residential loans that have gone bad is with the banks that actually own the Fed. Those are the banks that are too big to fail. The rest of the banks are left to suffer. And using their auditing process, they go around the circle and close out a bank. Its assets, like both the good and the bad, move up to another one that takes it over. And the next 6 months when they come around, they'll put that bank system out of business. But what they're doing with the big banks, who have taken Freddie and Fannie, they have taken all of the large banks' real estate holdings, which includes their off-balance sheet hedge funds accounts that took these credit default swaps, all of the toxic debt that's in that, and they are transferring a ledger balance, it's just a ledger action, of giving them, crediting them with cash and taking the ownership and holding it in the Fed, which is a private entity. Would you support legislation that would stop that?
Yes. Yes, and you referred to the fact that it's gonna take some time to get us to this point. The first thing we have to do to get us there, right, I referred to political will before. You have to have the political will to do certain things. To end the Fed or to take even that preliminary step you referred to, we have to start by auditing it. It hasn't been subject to any review, any oversight, any audit or anything, basically ever. And so the first step we've got to have toward that is auditing it. I'm quite confident if we subject the Fed to a thorough audit, forthwith, long overdue audit, it's going to reveal things that will create the political will to do the other things we've talked about,
Nice.
Let's hope that
including
the audit
implementing,
does.
ending the Fed altogether.
Nice.
My last question has to do with the large banks, again. This aspect of the credit default swaps which were so detrimental to the financial condition of our country. This is still going on.
Sure.
The largest number, when you look at the debt plot, is that $670 trillion figure. It far surpasses anything. The whole GDP of the earth is about 50 trillion. This is the large banks and their holdings of derivatives, and it is continuing to grow. Something needs to be done to curtail that. And I don't know whether it can be done through the Fed or through specific legislation aimed at those banks and entities that are involved in that.
Yeah.
Chuck, on top of that, who's selling the credit default swaps for sovereign debt right now? I mean, that's insane. If I hold $10 million worth of Greece's sovereign debt at 6% interest, I'm going to make $600,000 a year, right? I'm paying $635,000 a year credit default swap insurance. Whom am I paying that to?
Good question.
Yeah.
Well,
I mean, it's a mess waiting to happen again. It's bigger than anything we've ever seen.
These complex derivatives that you're talking about are part of what created the too big to fail dynamic. I do think there's got to be some regulation. I don't know whether it's state or federal or some combination of both, of derivatives, so that we make sure that you don't have these weird, not to swap terminology from a different area, but entangling alliances that you bring down one, you bring down all of them. There's got to be some regulation of that. It is a very complex area. I don't purport to have all the answers, but yeah, we need reform in that area too. Thank you very much. I think I've got time for 2 more questions, and then we can take more up here afterwards. Yes.
This is a question for the group. I mean, I hope you all realize we're not talking about who to vote for in November. The party may be over by November. How many of you intend to go to your neighborhood caucus meetings and be selected as a delegate for convention?
Here,
Raise
here.
your hand, please.
State delegates, not just county.
State
Nice.
delegates.
State delegates.
That's where it's
All right,
at.
glad to see that. Recruit other people in those delegates positions. Thanks.
As long as they don't support Ben.
Yes, sir. Mount Logan Middle School.
Yes, is that where the all meet here?
Believe so.
Well,